Hey class, this is Dr. Yankowski, and I wanted to put together a video to sort of discuss topic one, which is going to be covering chapters 1 through 4. So if you have any specific questions about the content contained within any of those chapters, please by all means get in touch with me and we can discuss further. I just want to point out some key concepts, some areas to focus on, and not just necessarily for the quiz or perhaps the final exam next month, but just for your own understanding of lifespan development. I know from the introductions that you've posted, a lot of you are either in nursing or in education, so don't just think that you have to understand the material to pass the course, which is a good thing, but also for your own knowledge. Hopefully, you're going to be able to apply a lot of this course to your career. So, I want you to be able to retain the information and understand it. So, some important things to consider for chapter one. And when we talk about understanding the lifespan perspective, we're thinking about it along a continuum, meaning that we're thinking about all of the various types of changes that occur from conception through death. And when we think about that, there's changes that specifically impact us in different ways. So the textbook does a really good job of breaking down these changes into different parts. So we'll be looking over the course of the next month at biological changes that take place, cognitive changes that take place, socio-emotional changes that take place. This is where I think from a psychological perspective, you'll find the course really interesting is when we think about the issues related to motivation and emotions and personality. Um, and then it's important to understand these individually, but then bring them together and begin to think about how biological and cognitive and socio-emotional processes are intertwined and overlap. And that may be a little bit more difficult to do, um, but a developmental psychologist really does try to put the person within the context in which they're developing. So think about an individual and place them in the context of their home life, their school life, their friends, their family, their neighborhood, all of those things and how they're overlapping and intertwining. And that's really how a developmental psychologist thinks. You can also be able to break down developmental psychology into different stages. That's sort of how I've tackled our sequence in Blackboard. Um, I've broken down the course into different stages. So each week we'll be focusing on a different period of development. So this first week we'll be looking at prenatal development and infancy. Um, we'll be looking at early childhood, middle and late childhood. The area that I'm probably most interested in and have the most research in is adolescence. There's definitely not cut and dried ages that correspond to these time periods, developmental stages. But when we think of adolescence, we tend to think of that period of the teens. Um, Interesting sort of new development in terms of trying to understand the different stages of lifespan development is the emergence of what we call emerging adulthood. It's sort of a transition period between adolescence and early adulthood. And this is where maybe many of you are falling right now. This is the area between adolescence and early adulthood. We tend to think of it the late teens, the early 20s. And then thinking about perhaps where your parents are, your grandparents are, perhaps middle adulthood, late adulthood. And you could sort of read about these specific age ranges and developmental changes that occur during each stage as we get further into the course. Of course, the theories are really important. I also think some of these have already been covered in previous classes, so please refresh yourself. And research methods, you should have also had these covered in previous psychology classes. Be mindful of experimental research. if I could find it here. When we talk about experimental research, it's the most powerful type of research that we have because it's able to control for extraneous variables. What we're doing is sort of separating groups into two separate areas. We have the experimental group, which oftentimes you'll hear people refer to as the experimental group being exposed to the treatment or the independent variable. Then we have the control group, which sometimes will receive a placebo. So essentially what we're doing in experimental group is trying to determine cause and effect. That's why experimental research is typically the most powerful. When all of the other factors between those two groups are held constant, what researchers are able to do is determine whether or not the independent variable, or what we call the treatment, which was given to the experimental group, had any impact on the dependent variable. That's the variable that you're measuring between both groups. So in the independent variable, it gets exposed to the treatment, it gets exposed to the experimental group. In the control group, there is no exposure, or if there is an exposure, it's a placebo, so you could have a comparison. And then what you're going to be measuring between the two groups is the dependent variable. So for instance, if you wanted to understand, let's say something like whether listening to music while you're studying for your first quiz has an impact, causes your grade to either increase or decrease. What we can do is separate people who are studying for the quiz into two separate groups, expose the people in the experimental group to music, not expose the people in the control group to no music, making sure that all other factors are held constant, that people who have enrolled in the study have been randomly assigned to either group. And then what we're measuring between the two groups, the quiz grade, is our dependent variable. If there is a significant difference between the grade in the experimental group on the quiz versus the grade in the control group, we can then say with much certainty that the music did cause that change because all of the other factors were held constant. That's what we're talking about in terms of experimental research. As we move into chapters 2, 3, and 4, you're going to be looking at different changes in infancy. So make sure you read through that. I just want to point you to a couple of important concepts in chapter 2 with biology. It's important for me to point out some issues in prenatal development. Be mindful of the fact that you will be getting questions randomly on your quiz related to all four of these chapters, so it's important to read through each chapter. But I want to point out that one of the issues related to prenatal development is the exposure to teratogens. And teratogens are any environmental impacts that could potentially alter or change or stunt the growth of the developing fetus. So oftentimes what women may be exposed to is some type of education when she finds out that she's pregnant, to alert her to certain environmental hazards that could potentially impact the development of the fetus. And you could see here in your section on hazards to prenatal development, you could look at the different types of teratogens that a woman can potentially be exposed to. Sometimes these are things that she may not even recognize that could have an impact, like non-prescription drugs, different types of psychoactive drugs, caffeine. A really important teratogen to be aware of is alcohol, and how drinking alcohol during pregnancy can perhaps lead to a spectrum of disorders known as fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASD. So make sure that you've read through that. Nicotine, cocaine, so recreational drugs can certainly be listed there. Marijuana, heroin, opioids, Also, I'm pointing out some of these things that she may ingest or take. Uh, but there's also hazards psychologically that she could be exposed to, like stress. Um, so it's important for her to be mindful of the types of teratogens that are available and developing a plan to either eradicate or minimize the exposure to teratogens. If you have any questions related to chapters 1 through 4, certainly by all means email or get in touch. As a reminder, your quiz and your writing assignment for topic 1 are due by this Sunday, 11:59 p.m. You're going to be taking your quiz in Connect. You're going to be submitting your writing assignment to Blackboard, and be mindful of the late policy, which is outlined in the syllabus. 10% deduction for each day late for the quiz, 10% deducted for each week or part of the week late for the writing assignment. I hope you all have a good rest of the day. I hope you have a great weekend. I'm available by phone or email, whatever you need over the weekend, so don't hesitate to reach out. And it's a holiday weekend, so enjoy yourselves as well. Take some time, hopefully good weather, and you can relax a little bit. Okay, take care.